Master and Margarita by Mikhail Bulgakov. Translated by Michael Carpelson. Read by Julian Rhind-Tutt.
Part 1. What are you already? I am part of that power that always wishes evil and always performs the good. Goethe, Faust. Chapter 1. Never talk to strangers. Once, upon an unusually hot hour of sunset in spring, two gentlemen appeared at Patriarch's Ponds in Moscow. The first sported a grey summer suit and was short, plump, and bald. He carried his respectable fedora in his hand, and black, horn-rimmed spectacles of supernatural proportions adorned his clean-shaven face. The second, a broad-shouldered young man with curly reddish hair, wore a cowboy shirt, craggy white trousers, black trainers, and a checked cap cocked to the back of his head. The first was none other than Mikhail Alexandrovich Berlioz, chairman of the board of one of Moscow's largest literary organizations, known by the acronym Massolit, and editor of a thick literary journal. His young companion was the poet Ivan Nikolaevich Ponyorov, who wrote under the pen name of Homeless. Upon reaching the shade of the freshly budding lindens, the writers first dashed towards a brightly painted booth bearing the sign Beer and Sodas. By the way, it is worthwhile to note the first strange thing about that horrible May afternoon. Not a single human being was to be found in the vicinity of the booth, or indeed in the entire alley that ran parallel to Malaya Bronaya Street. At an hour when it seemed almost impossible to breathe, when the sun, scorching Moscow, was plunging into the dry haze somewhere beyond the Sadovaya Ring Road, no one sought shelter in the shade of the lindens. No one sat down on the benches. The alley was empty. "Mineral water?" Berlioz requested. "We don't have any," the woman in the booth replied, taking offence for some reason. "Got beer?" Homeless inquired hoarsely. "Beer's coming later tonight," the woman replied. "What do you have?" asked Berlioz. "Apricot-flavoured water. Only it's warm," said the woman. We'll take it. The apricot water produced copious yellow foam, and the air began to reek of barber shop. After drinking their fill, the writers were immediately overcome with hiccups. They paid up and sat on a bench, facing the pond and away from Bronaya. Then something else strange happened, this time to Berlioz alone. His hiccups stopped suddenly, and his heart thumped and seemed to vanish for a moment. When it resumed beating, it was as though a blunt point had lodged in it. What's more, Berlioz was suddenly overcome with fear unfounded, yet so powerful that he wanted to flee the Patriarchs that very moment and never look back. Berlioz glanced round miserably, unsure of what frightened him so. He grew pale, dabbed his handkerchief on his forehead, and wondered, "What's wrong with me? This sort of thing has never happened before. Heart's misbehaving. I've worn myself out. To hell with everything. It's time to take that Kislovodsk vacation." And then the muggy air thickened before him and wove itself into a transparent gentleman of the strangest appearance. A tiny jockey cap on his tiny head, a short, checked, equally ethereal jacket on his shoulders. The gentleman was 7 feet tall, yet narrow-chested and incredibly thin, and with an insolent mouth, may I add. Berlioz's life had not prepared him well for unnatural phenomena. His eyes bulging, Berlioz paled even more and managed a single confused thought. This cannot be. Alas, it was. The tall, transparent gentleman hovered before him, swaying left and right without touching the ground. By this point, Berlioz was so overcome with horror that he shut his eyes. When he opened them again, he saw that it was all over. The haze had dissolved, the checkered man had vanished, and so had the blunt point from his heart. "What the devil!" exclaimed the editor. "You know, Ivan, I nearly had a stroke just now from all this heat. Even something like a hallucination." Berlioz attempted a chuckle. but alarm still darted in his eyes and made his hands shake. However, he eventually calmed down, fanned himself with his handkerchief, and, managing a lively, "Well then," resumed the speech interrupted by the apricot water. The speech, as it was later determined, involved Jesus Christ. Apparently, the editor had commissioned the poet to write a long anti-religious poem for the next issue of the journal. Ivan Nikolaevich managed to compose the poem in record time, but unfortunately it completely failed to please the editor. Though Holmes had painted the protagonist, that is to say Jesus, in the darkest of colours, the editor was of the opinion that the entire thing had to be rewritten, and therefore the editor was giving the poet a sort of lecture about Jesus, aiming to underscore the poet's principal mistake. It is difficult to say what exactly undermined Ivan Nikolaevich's piece, the descriptive power of his talent, or his complete ignorance of the subject. But his Jesus turned out to be a very lifelike, if unattractive, character. Berlioz, however, wanted to show the poet that the crux of the matter lay not in Jesus' nature, good or bad, but in the fact that Jesus, as a person, had never existed in the first place. That all the stories about this character were simple inventions, ordinary myths. It should be noted that the editor was a well-read man who supported his argument very skillfully with references to ancient historians. For instance, neither the famous Philo of Alexandria nor the brilliantly educated Josephus Flavius had mentioned so much as a word of Jesus' existence. Displaying profound erudition, Mikhail Alexandrovich also informed the poet, among other things, that the description of Jesus' execution in Book 15, Chapter 44 of Tacitus's famous Annals was nothing more than a later insertion and a forgery. Everything the editor now described was new to the poet, who listened alertly. His spirited green eyes were fixed on Mikhail Alexandrovich, and only occasionally would he hiccup and quietly curse the apricot water. "As a rule, there isn't a single Eastern religion," Berlioz was saying, "that doesn't involve a virgin begetting a god. Failing to invent anything original, the Christians created their Jesus in an identical manner. Jesus, who never actually lived. That is precisely where the main emphasis should be." Berlioz's high tenor carried through the deserted alley, and as Mikhail Alexandrovich ventured further and further into the sort of jungle where only a highly educated man can survive, the poet learned volumes of interesting and useful information about the benevolent Egyptian god Osiris, son of heaven and earth, about the Phoenician god Thammuz, about Marduk, even about the lesser-known but menacing god Huitzilopochtli, once greatly revered by the Mexican Aztecs. And just as Mikhail Alexandrovich was describing to the poet how the Aztecs fashioned likenesses of Huitzilopochtli out of dough, the first man appeared in the alley. Afterwards, when, frankly speaking, it was all too late, various agencies would compare their reports containing descriptions of this man. Their juxtaposition cannot help but amaze. Thus, the first states that the man was short, had gold teeth, and limped on his right foot. The second, that the man was of enormous height, had platinum crowns, and limped on his left foot. The third informs laconically that the man had no distinguishing characteristics. One must admit that not a single one of these descriptions is even marginally useful. First things first, the man in question did not limp on any foot, and was neither huge nor diminutive, but simply tall. As for his teeth, he had platinum crowns on the left side of his mouth and gold ones on the right. He wore an expensive grey suit and imported loafers to match. His grey beret was cocked brashly to one side, and a cane with a black handle shaped like a poodle's head was tucked under his arm. Looked to be 40-something, somewhat crooked mouth, smooth shave, dark hair. His right eye was black, the left green for some reason. Dark eyebrows, one set higher than the other. In short, a foreigner. Passing the bench where the editor and the poet were sitting, the foreigner gave them a sidelong glance, stopped, and suddenly sat down on the neighbouring bench, mere steps away from the two companions. "A German," thought Berlioz. Englishman, thought Holmes. Must be hot in those gloves, eh? The foreigner looked over the tall buildings, forming a square around the pond. It was clear that he was seeing the place for the first time, and that he found it interesting. He rested his gaze on the upper floors, their windows reflecting a fragmented image of the blinding sun that would soon leave Mikhail Alexandrovich forever. His eyes moved down, where the panes of glass began to darken in the approaching dusk. The foreigner chuckled at something contemptuously and narrowed his eyes, then placed his hands atop his cane and his chin atop his hands. "For example, Ivan," Berlioz was saying, "you have very nicely and satirically portrayed the birth of Jesus, Son of God. But the irony is that scores of God's sons had already come before Jesus, such as, say, the Phrygian Attis. To put it concisely, none of them was ever actually born, and none of them existed, Jesus included. And so, instead of writing of the Nativity, and say, the coming of the Magi, you must describe the awkward rumours surrounding this birth. Otherwise, according to your narrative, it turns out that he was actually born." At this point, Holmes made an attempt to put an end to the hiccups that had been tormenting him. He held his breath, which only caused a louder, more painful hiccup, and at the same time Berlioz interrupted his speech because the foreigner stood up suddenly and headed towards the writers. They looked at him with surprise. "Please forgive me for taking the liberty," said the newcomer with a foreign accent, but without butchering the words. "Since we are not acquainted, but the subject of your learned discussion is so interesting that—" Here he removed his beret politely, and the companions had no choice but to rise slightly and bow. No, more like a Frenchman, thought Berlioz. A Pole, thought Holmes. It should be added that straight away the foreigner made a most repulsive impression on the poet, while Berlioz found him rather appealing. Well, not exactly appealing, but, how would you say, intriguing, perhaps. "May I sit?" the foreigner inquired politely, and the companions somehow involuntarily moved apart. The foreigner sat nimbly between them and immediately joined the conversation. "Unless I am mistaken, you had been saying that Jesus never existed?" the foreigner asked, turning his green left eye to Berlioz. "No, you are not mistaken," Berlioz replied politely. "That is precisely what I said." "Oh, how interesting," the foreigner exclaimed. "What the devil does he want?" wondered Holmes, frowning. "And you were agreeing with your companion?" inquired the stranger, turning to the right towards Holmes. 100%, affirmed the poet, who loved overblown figurative expressions. "Incredible!" exclaimed the uninvited guest. Glancing round furtively and lowering his deep voice, he continued, "Forgive my pestering, but, as I understand, you don't believe in God either." He put on a frightened look and added, "I swear I won't tell anyone." "Yes, we do not believe in God," Berlioz said, smiling faintly at the tourist's anxiety, "but we are free to talk about it as we please." The foreigner leaned back on the bench and asked, practically squealing with curiosity, "You are atheists?" "Yes, we are atheists," Berlioz replied, smiling, while Holmes thought angrily, "Just can't let it go, the foreign snob." "Oh, how charming!" cried the extraordinary foreigner, turning his head from side to side to get a look at both writers. "In our nation, atheism surprises no one," Berlioz informed him with diplomatic poise. "Most of our population has long since made the conscious decision to stop believing in fairy tales about God." Here the foreigner pulled the following stunt. He got up and shook the amazed editor's hand, saying, "Allow me to thank you from the bottom of my heart." "What are you thanking him for?" Holmes inquired, blinking his eyes. "For a most important piece of information that I, as a traveller, find extremely interesting," explained the foreign oddball, raising his finger meaningfully. Indeed, the important piece of information had evidently had a great impact on the traveller, for he looked fearfully at the buildings around him, as if afraid of seeing an atheist in every window. No, he is not an Englishman, thought Berlioz, while Holmeless thought, where did he manage to learn Russian like that? That's what I'd like to know, and frowned again. But allow me to ask you, the foreign guest inquired, after some anxious pondering, what would you do with the proofs of divine existence, of which, as it is known, there are exactly 5? Alas, Berlioz replied regretfully, not a single proof is worth a damn, and mankind has long since consigned them to the archives. After all, you must agree that no proof of God's existence can be found in the realm of reason. Bravo! Cried the foreigner. Bravo! You have fully restated the thoughts of the restless old Emmanuel on this matter. But here's the embarrassing part. He fully demolished all 5 proofs, and then, as if mocking himself, devised a 6th one of his own. Kant's proof, the educated editor retorted with a thin smile, is equally unconvincing. No wonder Schiller said that Kant's discussions on this issue can only satisfy slaves, while Strauss simply laughed at the proof. Berlioz spoke, and wondered silently, but really, who is he? And how can he speak Russian so well? They ought to give this Kant 3 years or so in Solovki for these proofs of his, Ivan Nikolaevich slammed quite unexpectedly. Ivan, whispered an embarrassed Berlioz. But the idea of sending Kant to Solovki not only failed to surprise the foreigner, it absolutely delighted him. Precisely, precisely, he exclaimed, and his green left eye sparkled at Berlioz. That's just the place for him. Why, I told him back then at breakfast, say what you will, Professor, but I think you've cooked up something incoherent. It may be clever, perhaps, but what a pain to understand. People will just laugh at you. Berlioz's eyes bulged out. At breakfast? To Kant? What's he blathering about? He thought. However, the foreigner continued to the poet, unfazed by Berlioz's astonishment, it's impossible to toss him into Solovki, if only for the reason that he has now spent over 100 years in a place significantly further away. A place whence he cannot be extracted by any means, I assure you. Pity, replied the belligerent poet. I pity it too, the stranger confirmed, his eye flashing, and continued, but here's what bothers me. If there is no God, then may I ask, who governs man's existence and all world order? Man himself governs it, Berlioz replied quickly and sternly to this admittedly rather ambiguous question. I beg pardon, the stranger said softly. In order to govern, one needs to have a definite plan for some reasonable length of time. Allow me to ask you how man can govern anything, considering that not only is he unable to plan for even a laughably short period, say 1,000 years, but that he cannot even vouch for tomorrow. Here the stranger turned to Berlioz. Indeed. Imagine that you, for instance, begin to govern and direct yourself and others, and you start to develop a taste for it, so to speak. And suddenly you develop sarcoma of the lungs. The stranger grinned sweetly, as if the thought of sarcoma of the lungs brought him much pleasure. Yes, sarcoma. He repeated the sonorous word, grinning like a cat. And thus your government is over. You are no longer interested in anyone's fates but your own. Your relatives begin to lie to you. Suspecting something amiss, you first run to the best doctors, then to the quacks, and sometimes even to the fortune-tellers. As the first, so are the second and the third completely useless. You understand that yourself? Everything ends quite tragically. He who so recently fancied himself in control of something ends up lying motionless in a wooden box. Realizing that the horizontal man is now worthless, the others burn him in a furnace,
Could be even worse, though. One moment a man decides to visit Kislovodsk.
Here the foreigner narrowed his eyes at Berlioz.
Simplest thing in the world to do. Except he can't even accomplish that, because the next moment he slips and falls under a tram for some unknown reason. Certainly you don't suggest that he disposed of himself. Wouldn't it be more reasonable to think that someone else disposed of him?
The stranger let out a peculiar snicker. Berlioz took in the unpleasant story about the sarcoma and the tram with the greatest attention, and disturbing thoughts began to gnaw at him. He's no foreigner, thought Berlioz. A very strange character, but hang on a second, who is he?
I see you want to smoke,
the stranger said unexpectedly to Holmes.
Which brand would you prefer?
What, have you got different ones or something? The poet asked moodily, for he had run out of cigarettes.
Which would you prefer? The stranger repeated.
Fine, home brand, the poet replied unpleasantly. The guest immediately pulled a cigarette case out of his pocket and offered it to Holmes.
Home brand.
The editor and the poet were not so much amazed by the fact that the case contained precisely home brand cigarettes as by the case itself. It was of gigantic proportions and made of solid gold. As it opened, a diamond triangle flashed on the lid with white and blue fire. The writer's thoughts diverged. Berlioz, no, a foreigner, and Holmes, well, damn it to hell, ha! The poet and the owner of the cigarette case lit up, while the non-smoking Berlioz refused. I should refute him thus, Berlioz decided. Yes, man is mortal, no one denies that, but the fact is that... But before he could pronounce the words, the foreigner spoke.
Yes, man is mortal, but that's only half the trouble. The problem is that he is unexpectedly mortal. There's the trick. And, in fact, he can't even say what he'll be doing tonight.
What an awkward way to pose a question, mused Berlioz, and retorted, Well, that's an exaggeration. Tonight is more or less clear to me. Now, naturally, if a brick falls on my head on Grunauer...
A brick, the stranger interrupted forcefully, is never going to fall on anyone for no reason. More specifically, let me assure you that you can feel completely safe in that regard. You will die a different death.
Perhaps you know which exactly, and could tell me, Berlioz asked with understandable sarcasm, venturing into what was becoming a truly silly conversation.
Gladly, the stranger replied.
He looked over Berlioz as if he were fitting a suit, and muttered something through his teeth.
1, 2... Mercury in the second house. The moon has departed. 6. Disaster. Evening. 7.
At last he declared loudly and cheerfully, You will be beheaded. Holmes stared at the insolent stranger with savage fury. Grinning crookedly, Berlioz asked, And by whom, exactly? Enemies? Foreign interventionists?
No, came the answer. A Russian woman, a member of the Komsomol.
Berlioz mumbled, irritated by the stranger's little joke. Forgive me, but that's less than likely.
Forgive me as well, the stranger replied. But it is so. Oh, yes, and I also wanted to ask what you were going to be doing tonight, unless it's a secret.
No secret. In a little while I'll drop by my place on Sedovaya, and then at 10 I'm going to chair a meeting at Masalit.
That cannot possibly be, the foreigner objected firmly.
Why is that?
Because, the foreigner said, and squinted at the sky, where black birds darted silently in anticipation of the evening cool. Because Anushka has already bought the sunflower oil. Not only bought it, in fact, but spilled it as well. So the meeting will not occur.
Quite understandably, this statement was met with silence.
"Excuse me," Berlioz began after a pause, glancing at the absurd foreigner. "What does sunflower oil have to do with anything? And who is Anushka?"
"The sunflower oil has nothing to do with anything," Holmes said abruptly, evidently bent on declaring war on the interloper. "Have you, sir, ever spent time in a mental institution?"
"Ivan!" Mikhail Alexandrovich exclaimed quietly. But the foreigner was not a bit insulted, and laughed heartily. "Of course I have, and more than once," he exclaimed, laughing, but his unsmiling eye was fixed on the poet. "Is there a place I haven't been to? Pity, though. I never got around to asking the professor there what schizophrenia was. I guess you'll have to ask him yourself, Ivan Nikolaevich." "How do you know my name?" "Please, my dear Ivan Nikolaevich, who hasn't heard of you?" The foreigner produced yesterday's issue of the Literary Gazette from his pocket, and Ivan Nikolaevich recognized his own likeness on the front page, with his own poem immediately below. But while the proof of fame and popularity had so pleased him yesterday, it brought no joy to the poet this time around. "Excuse me," he said with a sinister expression. "Could you possibly wait here a minute? I'd like a couple of words with my companion." "Oh, it would be my pleasure," exclaimed the stranger. "It's so nice here under the lindens, and besides, I'm in no hurry."
"Listen, Misha," the poet whispered, pulling Berlioz aside. "He's not a tourist. He's a spy, a Russian emigre who sneaked back into the country. Ask him for his papers, or he'll get away."
"You think so?" Berlioz whispered worriedly, and thought, "He's right."
"Trust me on this one," the poet rasped in his ear. "He's playing dumb, trying to pry something out of us. You heard his Russian."
The poet looked sidelong at the stranger as he spoke, to make sure the man did not take off.
"Come on, let's detain him or he'll escape."
The poet took Berlioz by the arm and pulled him towards the bench. The stranger no longer sat, but stood beside it, holding some sort of booklet in a dark grey binding, a thick envelope made of expensive paper, and a business card. "Forgive me, but in the heat of our debate, I completely forgot to introduce myself. This is my card, my passport, and my invitation to visit Moscow to provide consulting services," the stranger said gravely, and fixed the writers with a piercing look. The two became embarrassed. "The devil! He heard everything," thought Berlioz, and gestured politely that there was no need to check papers. While the foreigner was thrusting them at the editor, the poet had time to see the title Professor in foreign letters on the card, as well as the first letter of a surname, a W. "Nice to meet you," the editor mumbled uncomfortably in the meantime, and the foreigner returned the documents to his pocket. Relations thus re-established, all three sat back down on the bench. "You were invited here as a consultant, Professor?" asked Berlioz. "Yes, a consultant." "Are you German?" inquired Holmes. "Me?" the professor asked, and paused to think. "Yes, German, I suppose," he said. "You speak Russian pretty well," Holmes noted. "Oh, I am actually a polyglot. I know a great number of languages," the professor replied. "What's your area of expertise?" Berlioz inquired. "I specialize in black magic." "How'd you like that?" flashed in Mikhail Alexandrovich's head. And you were invited here with regard to that area?" he asked, stammering briefly. "Yes, that one," the professor confirmed, and explained. "The State Library here unearthed some authentic manuscripts of the necromancer Geber of Aurillac, 10th century, and I am needed to help decipher them. I am the only specialist in the world on the subject." "Ah, so you're a historian?" Berlioz asked with considerable relief and respect. "I am a historian," the scholar verified, This evening we'll have a pretty curious history right here on the patriarchs, he added out of nowhere. And once again both the poet and the editor were taken aback. The professor beckoned them both closer, and as they leaned towards him, he whispered, "Keep in mind that Jesus did exist." "You see, Professor," Berlioz answered with a forced smile, "although we respect your considerable knowledge, we happen to hold a different point of view on the matter." "No need for any points of view," the strange professor replied. "He simply existed, and that's that." "But some sort of proof is required," Berlioz began. "No proofs required either," the professor replied, and began narrating quietly, his accent somehow disappearing. "It's all quite simple. In a white cape." Chapter 2. Pontius Pilate. In a white cape, with blood-red lining, shuffling with a cavalryman's gait, early in the morning, on the 14th day of the spring month of Nisan, there emerged on the covered colonnade between the two wings of Herod the Great's palace the procurator of Judea, Pontius Pilate. More than anything in the world, the procurator hated the smell of rose oil. Right now, everything heralded an unpleasant day, for the smell had been haunting him since dawn. It seemed as though the very cypresses and palms in the garden oozed the odour, as though the stream of rosy stench mixed into the smell of leather tackle, the smell of the guards. A faint smoke drifted into the colonnade, through the upper terrace of the garden, originating in the rear wings of the palace, where the first cohort of the 12th Lightning Legion had been stationed after accompanying the procurator to Jerusalem. Indicating that the sentries' cooks had started preparing dinner, this bitter smoke mingled with the same oily rose breath. "O gods, ye gods, why do you punish me so?" There is no doubt. It's back again, the incurable, horrific disease known as hemicrania. When half the head aches, there is no medicine, no salvation of any sort. I will try not to move my head. An armchair had already been prepared on the mosaic floor by the fountain. Looking at no one, the procurator sat in it and extended his hand to the side. The secretary respectfully placed a piece of parchment in the hand. Unable to suppress a grimace of pain, the procurator glanced over it briefly, returned the parchment to the secretary, and said with difficulty, "The defendant comes from Galilee. Has the case been sent to the Tetrarch?" "Yes, procurator," the secretary replied. "What of it?" "He refused to form a conclusion on the case and sent the Sanhedrin's death sentence to you for confirmation," the secretary explained. The procurator's cheek twitched as he said quietly, "Bring in the accused." From the garden terrace, 2 legionnaires immediately brought in a man about 27 years of age and stood him under the columns on the balcony in front of the procurator's chair. The man wore an old and torn blue chiton. His head was covered by a piece of white cloth, secured by a strap round his brow, and his hands were bound behind his back. His left eye was decorated with a large bruise, and the corner of his mouth was caked with blood. The visitor looked at the procurator with anxious curiosity. The procurator was silent for a moment, then asked quietly in Aramaic, "So you are the one who incited the people to destroy the temple of Jerusalem?" Throughout all this the procurator sat as though made of stone, and only his lips moved ever so slightly as he pronounced the words. The procurator was like a stone because he was afraid to disturb his head, which blazed with infernal pain. The bound man moved forward slightly and began to speak. "Good man, believe me." But the procurator cut him off immediately, never moving and never raising his voice. "Is it me you call a good man?" You are mistaken. All of Yerushalayim whispers that I am a vicious beast, and that is absolutely right." And just as monotonously he added, "Bring me Centurion Ratslayer." It was as though darkness had descended on the balcony when the Centurion appeared before the procurator. Mark, nicknamed Ratslayer, commander of a special sentry. Ratslayer stood a head above the tallest soldier in the legion, and his shoulders were so broad that he blocked the rising sun completely as he stood. The procurator spoke to the centurion in Latin. "The criminal calls me a good man. Take him outside for a moment and explain how he is to address me, but no maiming." All eyes but those of the motionless procurator followed Mark the Ratslayer as he walked away, waving at the prisoner to follow. Eyes generally followed Ratslayer wherever he appeared, on account of his height and, for those who saw him for the first time, on account of his disfigured face. His nose had once been smashed by a German club. Mark's heavy boots sounded off on the mosaic, and the bound man followed him noiselessly, leaving the colonnade silent but for the cooing of pigeons on the garden terrace by the balcony, and the intricate, pleasant song of the water in the fountain. The procurator wished he could rise, place his temple under the stream, and freeze in that position. But he knew that this too would be futile. Leading the arrestee from under the columns into the garden, Ratslayer took a whip from the hands of a legionnaire standing at the foot of a bronze statue. Swinging gently, he struck the captive on the shoulders. The centurion's motion was light and casual, but the bound man collapsed instantly to the ground, gasping for air, as though his legs had been cut out from under him. All colour fled from his face, and his eyes clouded. With his left hand, Mark hoisted the fallen man back on his feet as easily as if it had been an empty sack, and spoke in poor, nasal Aramaic. "You will address the Roman procurator as hegemon. Say nothing else. Stand at attention. Do you understand, or shall I hit you again?" The prisoner swayed, but regained control of himself. His colour returned. He caught his breath and replied hoarsely, "I understand you. Don't hit me." A minute later, he again stood before the procurator. A dim, sickly voice said, "Name?" "Mine," the prisoner replied hastily, expressing with all his being the desire to provide coherent answers and avoid further wrath. "I am acquainted with my own," the procurator said quietly. "Do not pretend to be dumber than you are. Yours." "Yeshua," the prisoner replied hurriedly. "Have you a surname?" "Hanotzri." "Where were you born?" "In the town of Gamala," replied the prisoner, motioning with his head that somewhere far to his right, to the north, lay the town of Gamala. "Who are you by blood?" "I do not know for sure," the prisoner said quickly. "I do not remember my parents. I've been told my father was a Syrian." "What is your permanent residence?" "I have no permanent residence," the prisoner said bashfully. "I travel from town to town." "There is a shorter name for that. A vagrant," the procurator said, and then asked, "Have you relatives?" "None. I am alone in the world." "Can you read and write?" "Yes." "Do you know any languages besides Aramaic?" "Yes. Greek." A swollen eyelid lifted slightly, an eye clouded with suffering stared at the prisoner. The other eye remained closed. Pilate spoke in Greek. "So, you wanted to destroy the building of the temple and called on the people to do so?" The prisoner livened up again, the fear left his eyes, and he spoke in Greek. "Good man,
Terror flashed in the eyes of the captive, for he had nearly misspoken. Hegemon, never in my life have I intended to destroy the building of the temple, and I certainly never incited anyone to such a senseless act. An expression of surprise appeared on the face of the secretary, who was hunched over his low table recording the testimony. He raised his head, but leaned back over his parchment immediately. Numerous people drift into this city for the holiday, among them magicians, astrologers, soothsayers, and murderers, the procurator spoke monotonously, and occasionally liars. You, for instance, are a liar. It is clearly written here, incited to destroy the temple, so say the witnesses. Those good people, said the prisoner, and hastily adding, Hegemon, continued, they were uneducated and misunderstood almost everything I said. In fact, I am beginning to fear that this whole mess is going to go on for quite some time, all because he records my words improperly. Silence fell. Now both sick eyes stared heavily at the prisoner. I repeat, but for the last time, stop feigning insanity, you scoundrel, Pilate said softly and monotonously. What's been recorded about you is not much, but it is enough to hang you. No, Hegemon, said the prisoner, straining in his effort to convince. This one man keeps following me with a goatskin parchment and writing incessantly. I saw his parchment once, and it horrified me. I hadn't said a single thing that was written there. I begged him, burn that thing for God's sake. But he tore it out of my hands and ran off. Who is he? Pilate asked with distaste, feeling his temple with his hand. Matthew Levi, the prisoner gladly explained. He was a tax collector when I first met him on the road to Bethphage, by the corner of a fig orchard that juts out there, and we got to talking. At first he was unfriendly, and even insulted me, or rather, he thought he was insulting me by calling me a dog. The prisoner smirked. I personally see nothing wrong with that particular animal to be upset at the name. The secretary stopped writing and stealthily cast a surprised glance, but at the procurator, not the prisoner. However, after listening to me, he began to warm up, Yeshua continued. At last, he threw his money to the ground and said he would travel with me. The procurator laughed with one side of his face, baring his yellow teeth, and turning his entire body towards the secretary, said, Oh, the city of Jerusalem. The things you'll hear in it. A tax collector, you see, threw his money to the ground. Unsure of how to respond, the secretary decided the best course of action would be to mimic Pilate's grin. He said that henceforth he found all money repugnant, Yeshua explained, regarding Matthew Levi's strange behaviour, and added, Since then he has been my companion. Still leering, the procurator glanced at the prisoner, then at the sun that rose steadfastly over the mounted statues of the hippodrome, far below and to the right. Suddenly, in some fit of nauseating misery, it occurred to him that it would be easiest to simply expel this odd villain from the balcony with but 2 words. Hang him. Expel the guards as well. Leave the colonnade for the palace interior, order the blinds drawn, collapse on the bed, demand cold water, call desolately for his dog Banga, complain to him about the hemicrania. And the thought of poison flashed seductively in the procurator's swollen head. He looked at the prisoner with clouded eyes and was silent for a moment, trying painfully to remember why a man, disfigured by beatings, now stood before him in Jerusalem's merciless morning sunlight, and what further useless questions needed to be asked. Matthew Levi? The sick man asked, hoarsely, closing his eyes. Yes, Matthew Levi, came a high-pitched voice tormenting him. And still, what was it you said about the temple to the marketplace mob? The responding voice seemed to stab Pilate straight through the temple. It was unspeakably torturous, and it spoke thus. "I said, hegemon, that the temple of old faith will fall, and a new temple of truth will rise. I said so to make it clearer. Why did you confuse the marketplace crowd, you tramp, with some truth of which you have no conception? What is truth?" And then the procurator thought, "Oh, God, I am asking him useless drivel at a trial. My mind serves me no longer." And again he imagined a chalice of dark liquid. "Poison! Give me poison!" Again he heard the voice. "The truth is, first of all, that your head aches, and so badly that you entertain craven notions of death. You are not merely incapable of speaking to me, but you can barely look at me. And right now, I am your involuntary torturer, which upsets me. You cannot even think straight, and you wish only for your dog, presumably the only creature you feel any attachment to. But your suffering will now end. Your head will be cured." The secretary stared at the prisoner, the writing unfinished. Pilate raised his tortured eyes at the prisoner, and saw that the sun now hung rather high above the hippodrome, that a ray had found its way into the colonnade and was creeping towards Yeshua's sandals, that Yeshua was backing away from the sun. The procurator rose from his seat, clutched his head in his hands, and horror appeared on his clean-shaven face. But he willed it away immediately and lowered himself back in the chair. Meanwhile, the prisoner continued his speech. But the secretary no longer wrote anything down. Stretching his neck out like a goose, he was trying not to miss a single word. "There. It's all over," the prisoner was saying, gazing benevolently at Pilate. "And I am very glad. I would advise you, hegemon, to leave the palace a while and take a walk somewhere nearby, say in the gardens on Mount Iliona." The prisoner turned, squinting at the sun. "The thunderstorm will begin later, towards the evening. A stroll would do you much good, and I would gladly accompany you on it. Some new ideas have come to me, ones I believe you might find interesting. I would gladly share them with you, for you seem a very intelligent person." The secretary grew deathly pale and dropped his scroll to the floor. "The trouble is," continued the bound man, unimpeded by anyone, "that you have closed up and utterly lost your faith in mankind. One cannot reserve all his affection for a dog, would you not agree? Your life is needy, hegemon." The speaker allowed himself a smile. By now the secretary was wondering only whether to trust his ears. He had no choice but to trust them. Then he tried to picture what bizarre form the hot-tempered procurator's wrath would take at the prisoner's unprecedented gall. But though he knew the procurator well, the secretary's imagination failed. Then came the procurator's hoarse, broken voice. "Untie his hands," it said in Latin. One of the legionnaires from the guard tapped his lance on the ground, handed it to his colleague, and approached to remove the prisoner's ropes. The secretary picked up his scroll, resolving to suspend his writing and contain his surprise. "Confess," Pilate said quietly in Greek. "Are you a great healer?" "No, procurator, I am no healer," the prisoner replied, massaging his twisted, swollen, purple wrist with great satisfaction. Pilate's sharp, sullen gaze bored into the prisoner. No longer dull, his eyes had regained their familiar spark. "I never asked you," said Pilate. "But perhaps you know Latin as well." "Yes, I do," the prisoner replied. Pilate's yellow cheeks reddened, and he asked the prisoner in Latin,
How did you know that I wanted to call my dog? It's very simple, the prisoner replied in Latin. You were moving your hand in the air. The prisoner reproduced Pilate's gesture, as though you meant to pet. And your lips... Yes, said Pilate. They were silent a moment, and then Pilate asked another question in Greek. So you are a healer? No, the prisoner replied briskly. Believe me, I am no healer. Very well. If you wish to keep your secret, keep it. This has no direct bearing on the case. So you maintain that you did not call for the demolition, or the burning, or some other means of destroying the temple? I repeat, Hegemon, I incited no man to such actions. Surely I do not seem that feeble-minded. Oh, no, you do not seem feeble-minded, the procurator said quietly, and smiled a frightening sort of smile. Then swear it never happened. What is it you wish me to swear by? The untied man asked, brightening visibly. Well, how about your life, at least? Answered the procurator. Now is high time to swear by it, for let it be known to you that it hangs by a thread. Are you under the impression that it is you who hung it thus, Hegemon? Asked the prisoner. If so, you are greatly mistaken. Pilate flinched and answered through clenched teeth. I can cut that thread. Here too you are mistaken, the prisoner objected, smiling radiantly and shielding his face from the sun. Surely you would agree that only he who hung the thread can cut it. Well, well, said Pilate, smiling. Now I have no doubts that Jerusalem's idle gapers followed at your heels. I don't know who hung your tongue, but it is hung well. Tell me, by the way, is it true that you entered Jerusalem by the way of Susim Gate, mounted on a donkey, accompanied by a screaming rabble that greeted you as some sort of prophet? The procurator pointed to the scroll of parchment. The prisoner gave the procurator a perplexed look. I don't even own a donkey, Hegemon, he said. I did come to Jerusalem through Susim Gate, but I was on foot, accompanied by Matthew Levi alone, and no one shouted a thing to me, as no one here knew me then. You happen to know the following people? Pilate continued, without taking his eyes off the prisoner. A certain Dismas, another, Hestas, or a third, Baraban. I do not know these good people. That is the truth. That is the truth. Now tell me, why do you constantly use the term good people? Do you call everyone that, perhaps? Everyone, the prisoner replied. There are no evil people on earth. First time I hear this, said Pilate, scoffing. But perhaps I have a poor grasp of life. You may stop recording, he directed to the secretary, though the man had long since stopped recording, and continued speaking to the prisoner. Did you read this in some Greek book? No, I arrived at this with my own mind. And this is what you preach? Yes. So take Centurion Mark, say. They call him Rat Slayer. Is he good? Yes, answered the prisoner. He is an unfortunate man, however. Ever since the good people disfigured him, he became harsh and callous. I wonder who maimed him thus. I will gladly tell you, Pilate replied, for I witnessed it personally. The good people threw themselves at him like dogs at a bear. The Germans snapped onto his neck, his arms, his legs. An infantry maniple was caught in a cul-de-sac, and had a turma of cavalry under my command not cut in from the flank, you, philosopher, would not have been talking to Rat Slayer just now. This was at the Battle of Edistavitso, in the Valley of the Virgins." If one were to have a talk with him, the prisoner said suddenly, in a wistful voice, "I am certain that he would undergo a radical change." "I imagine," Pilate replied, "that you would bring little joy to the legate of the Legion if you decided to converse with any of his officers or soldiers. Fortunately for us all, it will never happen, and I will be the first to ensure this." Just then, a swallow flew swiftly into the colonnade, describing a circle under the golden ceiling. It descended, just missing the face of a bronze statue in a niche with its sharp wingtip, and disappeared behind the capital of a column. Perhaps it had decided to build a nest there. During the course of its flight, a formula came together in the procurator's newly light and clear head. It went thus: the hegemon had examined the case of the travelling philosopher Yeshua, surnamed Hanotstri, and failed to substantiate the criminal charges laid out therein. In particular, not the slightest link was found between Yeshua's actions and the recent civil disturbances in Jerusalem. The wandering philosopher turned out to be mentally ill. Consequently, the procurator cannot confirm the Lesser Sanhedrin's death sentence. However, in view of the possibility that Hanotsri's insane utopian preaching may present a potential cause of unrest in Jerusalem, the procurator will remove Yeshua from Jerusalem and imprison him in Caesarea Stratonova on the Mediterranean, the location of the procurator's own residence. It remained but to dictate this to the secretary. The swallow's wings rustled inches above the procurator's head. The bird dashed towards the basin of the fountain and flew outside. The procurator raised his eyes to the prisoner and saw that a column of dust was glittering beside the captive man. "Is that all for this one?" Pilate asked the secretary. "Unfortunately, no," the secretary replied unexpectedly, and handed Pilate another piece of parchment. "What else is there?" Pilate asked, frowning. After reading the text, an even greater change came over his face. Whether it was due to a surge of blood to the neck and face, or some other reason, only his skin lost its yellow hue and turned brownish red, while his eyes seemed to collapse inside his head. The blood was probably again to blame, rushing and beating in his temples, when something happened to the procurator's vision. It appeared to him as though the prisoner's head had drifted off somewhere to be replaced by another. A golden wreath with rarely placed points rested atop this balding head. A rotting round sore, smeared with balm, adorned the forehead. The mouth was sunken and toothless, with a capricious hanging lower lip. It seemed to Pilate that the pink columns of the balcony and the roofs of Jerusalem far below had vanished, all of it drowning in the thickest green of Caprian gardens. His hearing, too, was strangely afflicted. He perceived the quiet yet menacing sound of trumpets somewhere far away, and a distinct nasal voice haughtily stretched the words, "The law concerning offence to the Imperial Highness." Then came thoughts, abrupt, scattered, and unusual. "Doomed," and then, "We're doomed," and another completely incongruous thought about someone's imminent immortality. Whose? For some reason, the thought of immortality brought on unbearable sorrow. Pilate tensed, purged the vision, and returned his gaze to the balcony, only to meet the prisoner's eyes again. "Listen to me, Hanotsri," the procurator began, giving Yeshua an odd look. The procurator's face was menacing, but his eyes were anxious. "Have you ever said anything about the great Caesar? Answer me, have you, or have you not?" Pilate emphasized not a touch more than a legal proceeding would call for, and tried to project some idea through his gaze, as if wishing to implant it in Yeshua's mind.
"It is always easy and pleasant to say the truth," noted the prisoner. "I do not need to know," Pilate responded in a choked, angry voice, "how pleasant or unpleasant it is for you to say the truth. You will have to say it regardless, but as you speak, weigh every word. That is, if you wish to avoid certain and most painful death." No one knows what happened to the procurator of Judea at that moment, but he allowed himself to raise his hand, as if to shade himself from the sun's rays, and from beneath the shield of his hand to send the prisoner a sort of hinting look. "So then," he said, "tell me if you know a certain Judas of Kiriat, and what exactly, if anything, you have said to him about Caesar." "It happened as follows," the prisoner began, narrating eagerly. "The day before yesterday I met a young man by the temple who called himself Judas of Kiriat. He invited me to his home in the lower city and treated me to—" "A good man?" Pilate asked, and devilish fire flashed in his eyes. "A very good and inquisitive man," the prisoner confirmed. "He expressed the greatest interest in my ideas and received me quite warmly." "Lit the candles?" Pilate said through clenched teeth, matching the prisoner's tone, and his eyes glimmered. "Yes," continued Yeshua, mildly surprised at the procurator's knowledge. "He asked me to share my views on the rule of our government. This question interested him immensely." "And what did you say?" asked Pilate. "Or are you going to claim you've forgotten what you said?" But hopelessness had already crept into his voice. "Among other things," recounted the prisoner, "I had said that any sort of rule is a form of violence exercised over people, and that there will come a time when there will be neither rule of Caesars nor any other rule. Man will enter the kingdom of truth and justice, where no rule will be necessary." "What else?" "Nothing else," said the prisoner. "At that point, some men ran in, tied me up, and took me to prison.